All right, we are on section M. John Marshall. We're talking about John Marshall again, and judicial nationalism. All right, so let's talk about John Marshall here for a second. John Marshall is clearly a Federalist, all about a strong national government, all about lots of power for the national government. He was a loose constructionist when it came to the Constitution. So his idea is if the Constitution didn't forbid it, it permitted it. All right, so kind of a loose interpretation of the Constitution. What it doesn't forbid, it permits. Also, he thought of the Constitution as kind of a living document, a document that could be interpreted differently or kind of could change with the times. So he was all about this living Constitution that would change with the times, about kind of being loose in the interpretation of it. Also, John Marshall, we're talking about him a lot because he sets a lot of precedents in his 34 years as being head of the Supreme Court. We talked about one of those already, being Marbury versus Madison, establishing judicial review, saying it's the Supreme Court that gets to decide if something is constitutional or not. So he doesn't disappoint. There's a bunch more court cases about which we shall learn from John Marshall. So let's talk about it. Section M kind of talks about three big court cases, and the link that kind of binds them together is the fact that these three court cases, McCulloch versus Maryland, Cohen versus Virginia, and Gibbs versus Ogden, they all limit the power of the state, or they all limit the state's rights. So let's look at these here for a second. McCulloch versus Maryland. Maryland had been trying to murder, or I should say kill, a branch of the Bank of the United States through taxing it. So they're trying to kill this bank through taxing it. So John Marshall says, one, okay, the Bank of the United States is constitutional, and two, Maryland, you don't have the right to tax it because it's national. So it's limiting Maryland's right to tax the bank, and it's also declaring the national bank to be constitutional. All right, so our next kind of case that shows the limitation of states' rights by Marshall is Cohen's versus Virginia. So the Cohen brothers, I feel like that should be like an acting dynasty, but I don't think that is something. Anyway, but the Cohen brothers of Virginia were found guilty of illegally selling lottery tickets. Bad Cohen brothers. So, actually John Marshall upholds this conviction. So John Marshall actually agrees with the state of Virginia, saying, yes, you cannot sell lottery tickets, Cohen brothers. But what it does is through this, it's asserting its right to review state decisions. So remember, Cohen versus Virginia, it actually came from the Supreme Court of Virginia. So the Supreme Court of Virginia said that Cohen brothers, guess what? You are wrong. But through taking up this court case, or by reviewing this court case, the Supreme Court is asserting their authority to say, we have the right as the federal Supreme Court to review any decisions we choose that happen on just a state level. So kind of showing the prominence of the federal court system, limiting the right of the state through being able to review their decisions, or to change, I should say, their decisions if they see fit. All right, so the third kind of limit of state rights court case is called Gibbs versus Ogden, and this is called the Steamboat case. So this has to do with trade between New York and New Jersey. So New York and New Jersey are obviously right next to each other, separated, I think, by the Hudson River. So the state of New York wanted to give a monopoly to a private company for trade in between New York and New Jersey. So New York wanted to give, Company X the monopoly of trade between New York and New Jersey. And what Gibbs versus Ogden, in that, what Marshall does is say, hey, guess what, New York? You cannot do that. because when you're talking about trading between New York and New Jersey, that's interstate trade, or trade among more than one state, which falls under federal jurisdiction, which says Congress has the right to regulate interstate trade, not New York. So it's once again asserting federal power, saying we have the right to regulate interstate trade, not you, New York. So that's another case of it's really limiting the state's rights. All right. So we're not done talking about Marshall. The next section talks about Marshall as well. Section N talks about judicial dikes against democratic excesses. So dikes in the proper sense of the word is kind of like a flood wall. So a dike is a wall they build to protect, a city or farmland or whatever, what have you, against floods. So this is kind of the analogy here is Marshall is setting up some walls to protect, in this case, I guess, property rights against states. It'll make sense in a little bit. If that makes sense, that's fine. All right. So this section has two big court cases, and they both have to do with property rights. All right, Fletcher versus Peck. What happened is Georgia, the Georgia Congress or legislature gave 35 million acres of lands to a private speculator, which was kind of like bad move Georgia. So people in Georgia were obviously like super ticked off that Georgia had just given this land to these speculators. So the next time around, the next section of Congress, backtracks and says, oh, never mind, we don't give you that land, we take that land back. However, this issue actually gets all the way to the Supreme Court. And what Marshall does, or I should say the whole Supreme Court, but under Marshall's control, you could say a little bit, upheld the speculators' position, saying, no, Georgia, you had made a contract with these speculators. Although, that was probably a bad contract to make, regardless, you had made a contract with them. And according to the Constitution forbids states from impairing contracts or from breaking contracts. So this is really, it's a clear assertion of the Supreme Court's right to invalidate state laws, and it also reminds states that, hey, you don't have the power to break contracts. You can't do that. So once again, it's kind of, it's a defense of property rights, in this case the rights of those speculators, against public pressure. So like the public was pressuring Georgia into revoking that contract or in getting that land back. The Supreme Court saying, no, state, you don't have that right to break that contract. All right, so the next one kind of dealing with property rights again, which will of course limit the power of the states again. Who'd have thunk a federalist would want that? Is the issue of Dartmouth College versus Woodward. Okay, so Dartmouth is a college. Wow. Whoa. We're getting deep now, Miss Sharon. So Dartmouth is a college that was established back in the colonial days by King George III. So now that, we're our own country now, New Hampshire starts taking control of Dartmouth. I'm not even saying Dartmouth, whatever. Starting to take control of the college and starting to make changes to it. Dartmouth does not like this at all, so they hire a renowned lawyer whose name is Daniel Webster to fight for the right of the college to kind of be by themselves, not to be changed by the state of New Hampshire. So what, Marshall says is, guess what? This charter, even if it is with our arch nemesis, George III, that charter is a contract. And states, once again, you do not have the right to infringe on, to impair, to break any of these contracts that are made between, two private entities or whatever. So it's another, strike against state rights, but another, plus for property rights for people. And the section kind of just ends up kind of talking about John Marshall and his connection with Daniel Webster. We just talked about Daniel Webster being the lawyer who is arguing for Dartmouth's ability to keep the original charter, for Dartmouth's ability to stay kind of protected from the interference of New Hampshire. But really what it is, John Marshall was the Supreme Court with upholding Federalist ideas. Daniel Webster really was in the Senate. So John Marshall, Supreme Court Federalist guy, Daniel Webster, Senate Federalist guy. So they would oftentimes Daniel Webster would be arguing a case in the Supreme Court, and John Marshall would then uphold that. So it kind of just talks about that. Both very conservative, both, in line with Hamilton. They were both kind of countercultural at this time, because at this time, when Democratic Republicans reigned supreme, it was all about democracy, the will of the people. And it was really just Daniel Webster and his friend here, John Marshall, that were really the voice of the Federalist Party, which was more or less gone, but that ideals were still there. So they're more or less the only people really sticking up for the right of the national government. All right, so that's kind of exciting. All right, section O, sharing Oregon and acquiring Florida. So in this section, we're going to be both talking about the Oregon Territory and Florida. Wow. All right. So something we need to start talking about before we talk about either Oregon or Florida is that we have a new Secretary of State. So under Monroe, the Secretary of State is John Quincy Adams. Okay, so Quincy Adams here is the son of our second president, John Adams. So now John Quincy Adams is the Secretary of State. He's kind of like a rock star. We'll be talking about him in kind of 3 different incidences that happened throughout the rest of the chapter. So anyway, so let's talk about Oregon, okay? So through, diplomatic means, that sort of thing, we make an Anglo-American convention, or kind of like a pact or deal. So anytime I say Anglo, of course, I mean like English. So English-American convention, this is a deal between Britain and America regarding some of this disputed territory. So what it is it allows New England fishermen, so like Americans, to access Newfoundland fisheries. So American fishermen can go to Canada to fish. We liked that. It establishes the northern border of the Louisiana Purchase, because remember, now America is kind of the southern neighbor to British-owned Canada, so we established that northern border of our newly acquired Louisiana Purchase. And it kind of makes a deal that we'll both occupy then the Oregon country for 10 more years. So if you look in your book, I think it's on page 265, there's a map that more or less just shows you what I just said. So that's kind of what we're doing with Oregon. We're going to share Oregon. We're not going to fight over that for at least 10 more years. Whatever. All right. And then so now we're going to hop over to Florida, because Florida has orange juice, and that is very healthy. All right, so America just kind of believes they have the right to Florida. It would make sense that it's ours, since it's just kind of sticking out there, and we're just like, Florida should be ours. So anyway, we already had parts of the panhandle of Florida, already parts of the western part of Florida, but we want it all. We want more. And of course now Spain is the one in control of Florida. And Spain's been in control of Florida for a long, long, long time. So what happens is we kind of seize our opportunity. There are some revolutions breaking out in Spanish-owned sugar islands in the West Indies. So these revolutions are breaking out in the West Indies, so a lot of the Spanish troops that were in Florida have to leave town and take care of business in these sugar islands in the West Indies. So now that Spain kind of has cleared out a little bit, Jackson, on his own accord, kind of makes the first move. Jackson, under the pretext of saying, oh, I need to pursue some, Native Americans in there. I need to recapture some runaway slaves. I just need to go into Spain to, kind of deal with some natives who are hiding out there and to recapture some runaway slaves who are hiding down there. So under this pretext, he goes down to Florida, but sooner than later, his true motives become crystal clear. when he overtakes a couple of Spanish forts and he kicks out the Spanish governor. So he's kind of just like taking over Florida on his own accord. Like, we didn't send him down there to do this. So Monroe and Monroe's group of advisors, or their cabinet, were like, what are you doing, Jackson? Like, we are going to punish you. You're bad. But no, James Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State, he decides, no, we can use this to our advantage. So, instead of apologizing to Spain for Jackson's behavior, he monopolizes on his behavior. Or he goes to Spain and says, hey, do you happen to notice that we kind of just overtook Florida? Let's make a deal. All right, so they do make a deal. It's called the Florida Purchase Treaty, also known as the Adams-Onis Treaty. And in this treaty, Spain gives up Florida, which is the biggest part of this. Spain gives up Florida, so we get Florida, which is awesome. And in return, America gives up some kind of murky claims they had to Texas. And also in this treaty, we kind of established a border between the Louisiana Purchase and between the Spanish-owned kind of Texas-Mexico area. Because remember, at this time, Spain still owned most of Mexico, most of Texas. So we established a border between our two countries over in Louisiana Purchase and Texas, and then we kind of give up any claims we had in Texas, but we get Florida, so we don't care. So this is actually a really good thing for America. And that 265, again, in your book, has that picture that kind of shows you that as well. So this is just John Quincy Adams being a rock star. He really helped us when it came to Oregon, figuring that out with Britain, and now he's really helping us when it comes to Florida. But remember, we wouldn't have been able to get Florida had not Jackson kind of overstepped his bounds and like kicked Spain out. So we can really owe that to Jackson as well. All right, next section, section P, the Menace of Monthly. Okay, so remember during the French, not the French anymore, remember during the War of 1812, how I talked about a little bit that Napoleon lost power. Napoleon was exiled to an island. Well, now, France is trying to pick up the pieces of Napoleon. So now a lot of monarchs are reinstated. So in France, they had this huge revolution, to set up its democracy. It doesn't work. So it actually goes back to a monarchy. So now monarchs are back in charge. Monarchs, meaning kings and queens, are back in charge in Europe. And they, more than anything, want to squash anything that's democratic. Because democracy has wreaked havoc in Europe for too long. So they're trying to go back to the way it was before Napoleon, before the French Revolution, and they're squashing anything that was democratic. There's an uprising in Italy, they dominated that. There's an uprising in Spain, they crushed that like a spider in my kitchen. I have no mercy. I just take my shoe and that spider is dead. Anyway, off track. Alright, so Americans were kind of scared because Americans were the biggest spider of all, okay? Americans were the hub of democracy. And remember, like I was saying before, Spain had to leave Florida because there were a lot of revolutions going on kind of in Latin America, in these West Indies, in these sugar islands. So these revolutions were actually being successful. People were overthrowing the French, overthrowing the Spanish, and setting up their own countries. So there's a lot of kind of like little baby democracies springing up on these sugar islands. The plot like gravy thickens, shall we? We're just setting up something more exciting. Anyway, so backtracking, I forgot to talk about Russia. Hey, Russia. So Russia was starting to slowly but surely creep over to Alaska and then down that Pacific coast. So they went to Alaska, they're going kind of through Canada, they were in Oregon, and they had, trading posts all the way down to modern-day San Francisco. So slowly but surely, we were kind of becoming frightened or weary of Russia, because Russia kind of started to slowly creep down that west coast, and we were afraid that Russia was looking to kind of establish a colony in, Alaska, in Oregon, on that west coast. And if Russia established that colony, they would block us from being able to access the Pacific Ocean. So we're kind of very weary of Russia at this time. You'll need to know about them a little bit, but not right now. So just so you know. All right, so this is what happens. So the Sugar Islands are having these revolts, becoming these democratic little baby nations. So remember, like I said, all of Europe is just more than or less eager to crush democracy wherever they see it, and a very easy target then would be these little Sugar Islands. Well, most of Europe is for crushing the democracies, but not Britain, because Britain is actually enjoying the fact that these little baby countries, these little baby Sugar Islands that used to be controlled by Spain or used to be controlled by France, now kind of opens their doors to trade with Britain. So Britain now has new trading buddies in the West Indies, because before, when Spain controlled the Sugar Island, that Sugar Island only sold to Spain. So, but now that they're their own country, these Sugar Islands are open to trade with Britain. So Britain likes this a lot. So Britain couldn't care less about democracy. Britain's looking to make money. So it was very surprising then when Britain started to talk to Americans and were saying, like the British foreign minister asked the American minister in London to team up with them. So make a British-American team, and then together they would threaten Europe to ensure that Europe kept their hands off of Latin America countries. So Britain is now talking to America saying, hey, let's make a team, let's team up, and together we'll ensure that these little democracies will live. Okay, next section. All right, Monroe and his doctrine. Well, Monroe is a pretty smart guy, and so is his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. That's right, John Quincy Adams, the rock star who helped us with Oregon, helped us with Florida, is now going to help us kind of navigate the waters, so to speak, with these new democracies in the Sugar Islands. So what Monroe is thinking is, why in the world would Britain want to team up with us? It's like the all-state basketball player, wanting to team up with the guy who never ever plays and who's like the worst basketball player ever. It's like, why would you want to team up with us? Britain, like, do you not realize we are pretty much the weakest country ever? Like, why do you need our help? Wait, you don't. So John Quincy Adams was very weary of, why would you want to team up with us? And what he figures out is what Britain is thinking is that if they make this deal, if we both go in together and say, hey, you cannot take over these Sugar Islands, what we'd be saying is that we'd be promising to the world that we, the Americans, wouldn't overtake these Sugar Islands as well. Do you see what I'm saying? You see what I'm saying? So Britain's trying to trick us into saying that we won't overtake these Sugar Islands, because frankly, Britain doesn't care at all about the democracy. They want these Sugar Islands to be independent, so they'll trade with Britain, and Britain's weary that over time America might actually overtake these Sugar Islands and incorporate these Sugar Islands into America, and they don't want that to happen. Britain does not want us to overtake these Sugar Islands, and they feel that might happen kind of naturally over time. So they're trying to kind of trick us into declaring to the world that we will not overtake these Sugar Islands. So what Monroe decides to do, therefore, is to make a declaration. It's not a law, it's not a treaty, it's just a declaration. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. And what he says is, hey, the era of colonization in the New World is over. He's kind of looking at Russia when he says this. Russia, you're not going to colonize. We are closed for business. No more colonization in the New World. Speaking about the Sugar Islands, speaking about America. Okay? And, European powers, you can keep what you have, but we forbid you from coming over to the New World and colonizing. So they're pretty much saying, hey, stay out of these South American countries or else. Okay, Monroe, you're pretty gutsy. So let's talk about this section R, the last section, Monroe's Doctrine appraised. Okay, so Europe is really annoyed at Monroe for saying this. Monroe's saying, hey, you can't go into the Sugar Islands or you're going to have to mess with us. You're going to have to, if you mess with the Sugar Islands, you're messing with us. And Europe was really annoyed because they're like, you know, America, that we could whoop you if we wanted to. But it's Britain really that's preventing us from taking the Sugar Islands. It's not America at all that's preventing us. It's Britain, because Britain has that powerful navy, because Britain wants to have those democracies thrive so they would trade with Britain. It's Britain's power that's keeping us from going to these Sugar Islands. It's not you, America. So they're really annoyed that we're saying this. Oh, we'll forbid you to come to these Sugar Islands, or else we'll take you on and we'll crush you. It's kind of a weird story, but it's definitely the Europeans had their hands tied because of the British Navy. America's pronouncement compared to the military power we actually had was pathetic. I mean, there's no way we would have been able to prevent France or even Spain from attacking the Sugar Islands. And the people in South America, they were more or less unimpressed by this Monroe Doctrine because they knew it was Britain, not America, that was keeping them safe. So in South America, these Sugar Islands are like, yeah, we're really not impressed by your declaration because you have no backing to your words, okay? We know it's really Britain that's keeping us safe. All right. But anyway, kind of in the end, it was kind of a self-defense doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was self-defense, meaning we really did not want to have France. We didn't want to have Spain. We didn't want to have Britain. We didn't want to have any European powers kind of in these islands because that was really close to us. Okay, so it was kind of a self-defense sort of thing. We were saying, hey, don't come over here because you're threatening us and you're threatening them. And it was a proclamation. It had no really authority. The next president could easily just change his mind, but it really it was an expression of nationalism. It was saying, we're growing up, we're our own country now. You need to treat us with respect, that sort of thing. So it was kind of like a show of nationalism. Anyway. All right, so this concludes then chapter